So you finally got into reading in 2024, but you're now swimming in a sea of confusing terminology. Like, what the heck is a TBR? What does DNF mean? And why are so many people obsessed with being a reader? Stay tuned to find out all these and more on today's episode. Welcome to Fully Booked, the Bookish podcast where I'll chat about all things book and reading related. Whether you're a new or a pro reader, there's something for everyone to learn. I'm here to help you on your reading journey and find that next great read that will keep you fully booked. Hello readers, and welcome to episode 10 of Fully Booked. I'm your host Natalie, and today's episode will be a beginner's guide to bookish terms, acronyms, and really any language that all of us in the book community use on a regular basis. This episode, we're really going to go down the rabbit hole of the book world. And of course, I do not expect to cover every single term/lingo you'll hear, but I'm going to do my best to cover some basics for those listening who find themselves using an Urban Dictionary every time after reading a Goodreads review or watching YouTube videos, if you're already into book content, that is. So, let's first dive into some common bookish acronyms. And note that these are in no particular order. So the first acronym that I have for you is probably one of the most common ones that you're going to hear across the online book community, whether it be on BookTube, Bookpod, Bookstagram, and that is TBR, i.e. to be read. And these are books that you haven't read yet, but want to read. And as I just mentioned, if you watch a lot of book content creators, but probably mainly booktubers, you'll see a lot of people like to share their TBRs for the month, year, season, mood/vibe, etc. There really are no rules for creating a TBR. You can keep it as simple or make as many sublists as you want and add as many books as you want. For example, according to my Goodreads, I currently have 430 books on my entire TBR, which I have then broken down into 21 sub-TBRs/lists, all categorized by genre/subgenre. And the reason I like to do it this way is so that if I know I want to pick up a book of a certain genre, I can just easily check one of my lists and easily pick a book from there. And as someone who reads multiple books at a time, this is extremely helpful, so I always have books of different flavors to read. Now, next up on the list is another acronym commonly used across the online book community, which is DNF, i.e. did not finish. And these are books that you attempted to read, but did not end up completing for whatever reason. You can also hard or soft DNF books as well, where a hard DNF means you are never picking up this book again, versus a soft DNF means that this is a book you might want to revisit in the future, and likely it was just the wrong time to be picking up said book. In general, I personally don't like DNFing books because it likely means I'm picking up more books that are not suited to my reading preferences at all. And I'd rather pick up fewer but better quality books that I know I'll enjoy the whole way through. Which is probably why I don't have many books rated below 3 stars, as if a book is bad enough to be rated 2 stars or below, for me, I'd rather stop reading the book entirely than try to finish it just to see if there's any chance for redemption. So I can be pretty heartless this way when it comes to my reading. Of course, I do still struggle with the guilt aspect of DNFing, especially when I've DNF'd so many books in a row, or if I'm just not liking a mainstream popular author's books. But at the end of the day, when it comes to your reading, you gotta do what you gotta do. So conversely to the two acronyms that I just described, you can also have a CR, i.e. current read. And this is simply the book/books that you are currently reading, as the acronym says. Not much more to say here, except that let me guys know if you read one book at a time like a normal person, or if you're also a monster like me and read more than one book at one time. And sometimes I wish I read one book at a time so I could post my CR on my socials like other book content creators do, just because I think it looks cool. But I feel like it looked too weird to post multiple books on a CR, and I constantly switch between each of the books that I'm reading each day. So I never really have one more active book that I'm reading that I could post. But anyways, I guess these are simply the struggles of being a toxic multiple book reader. Now, this next one is funny because when I used to hear the word arc, I would just simply think of arc as in a story arc or a narrative arc, along those lines. I didn't actually realize this was an acronym used across the online book community and the publishing industry. So, in addition to a story arc, you can also have an arc, or some people like to say ARC, which is an advanced reader's copy. And this is a copy/edition of a book that hasn't been released to the public yet, and is typically distributed from the publisher to various people in the book/publishing industry. Example, librarians, journalists, and nowadays even content creators, which can include booktubers, podcasters like myself, bloggers, etc. The copy can be an incomplete story where maybe the ending hasn't been written yet, or the book hasn't been fleshed out and edited entirely, or it can be a complete story. As a new book podcaster, this is the dream to be selected to read and review an arc. And actually, I am about to make this dream happen, as I just recently got access to an arc for a book that I believe is set to come out next January, so a couple more months, but I already got access to a Kindle edition, so I'm hoping to read that over the next couple weeks, and hopefully you guys will get to hear my review of that soon. And it'll be interesting because it's actually by an author that I haven't read her other books yet, so I'm very excited that the first book I'll get to read is an arc. So yeah, we'll see how that goes. Now, you guys, we're really getting to the good acronyms here and moving further down the rabbit hole of the book world. So the next two that I have for you are MMC, i.e. male main character, and FMC, i.e. female main character. And these are just as they say, the main/lead male and or female in a story. Depending on the genre and whatnot, the MMC versus FMC can play differing roles, and either one's story can be more of the focus. And I think this is especially true and seen in fantasy books, where one MC will be the destined hero/heroine, and the other will be more of a supporting character or sometimes love interest, something like that. Meanwhile, other stories like romances or literary fiction will have more equal focus on both characters' stories and perspectives. One point that I will make here is that I find it more interesting when authors write MCs of the opposite gender from their own. So, i.e., a female author writes a MMC or vice versa. I think it's harder to write from the perspective of the opposite sex no matter what, as there are differences in speech, prose, or flow, perspectives, thought and behavior patterns, and so on that won't be innately known or come out as nuanced when you're writing about / from the opposite gender. Actually, I most enjoy male authors who can write a really good FMC, as it's nice to tell how well men can understand the female experience from their perspective. And yeah, I really like seeing this as a female. And finally, moving on to the last acronym in this list, we have TW/CW, i.e. trigger or content warnings. And these are elements, themes, plot events, etc. that can come up in a story that might be triggering/traumatic to certain individuals. With the expansion in genres, I feel like there's more TWs than ever coming up in books now. And I've tried to gather a list to show some examples that can come up, but note that this is not at all exhaustive. And if you are going to read a book that could be triggering, please be sure to check out online resources/reviews to get a complete list of TWs for your own safety/precaution. So some TWs that can come up are abortion, physical/mental/emotional abuse, child abuse, alcohol/alcoholism, anti-Semitism, anxiety, physical assault, sexual assault, blood, cannibalism, depression, drugs, eating disorder, mental disorder, any kind of phobia, example, fat phobia, queer phobia, transphobia, etc., gun violence, domestic violence, miscarriage, murder, prostitution, PTSD, racism, rape, self-harm, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, suicide/suicidal attempts/suicidal thoughts, and so on. And again, the list can get specific depending on the type of book that you're reading. So again, please make sure to always get a complete list of the TWs. But anyways, that wraps up all the Bookish acronyms I have. Let's move on to some Bookish terms. Again, this is not in any particular order, nor is it an exhaustive list of terms. Now, the first term that I have for you here is more like a bunch of terms that fall under the umbrella of social media. So they are BookTube, BookTalk, Bookstagram, and Bookish podcasts. Now, all of us should be familiar with social media in this day and age, so it shouldn't be surprising how big the world of the online book community is. For me, my first gateway into the online book community was BookTube, because I really watched a lot of YouTube and came across lots of reading videos as I looked stuff up early on in my rediscovering reading journey, so around 2022. And I honestly haven't stopped watching since, as I find it so interesting to see what other people around the world are reading at any given time. And lately, BookTube has become my background noise for everything when I'm at home, cooking, cleaning, or reading. And likewise to BookTube, all the ones I mentioned are just as they sound. So BookTalk is book content on TikTok, and Bookstagram is book content on Instagram. And I think a podcast is pretty explanatory on its own. One thing I'll say about following different book content/content creators is that it's a great way to keep expanding your TBR and reading interests, as Bookish content is the number one way that I get my reading recs, and part of the reason why I started this podcast, so I could then share my reading recs and experiences with people all over. Of course, there are criticisms of the online book community and social media and the content being created, particularly I would say with Book Talk, and how beneficial book content actually is for promoting reading versus being a reader, which I'll get into later. But if you're new to reading, I would say that social media/book content is a great way to dive more into the reading world. Now, next up on this list of terms, we have the backlist, which, funny story, because this is a term I kept hearing come up on reading podcasts I listened to and didn't really know what it meant for the longest time until I finally looked it up. So basically, all a backlist is books published in the previous years that are still available on the market and not the current year. Current year books are then typically referred to as frontlist books, and likely ones that you'll find more near the front of a bookstore. One thing I will say about backlist books is that I find now I tend to struggle with getting around to reading them, especially by certain authors who may have a huge backlist. My tendency is to keep up with all the frontlist books, especially because most of the authors I follow grind out their releases and have a new release every single year. And there's just something exciting about being that person to read a new release within the first few months. But I definitely miss out on a lot of great reads by neglecting the backlist books, so hopefully I can do my best to get around to more of them. In addition, I start neglecting certain authors entirely, since as soon as I find an author's books that I like, I tend to stick to them and read every single one of their books. And this is especially a fault when it comes to romance authors. So anyways, just like how backlist songs or albums from artists can be just as good as the new releases, don't forget about those backlist books. Now, moving on to dog-earing. Maybe some of you have heard of this already, but dog-earing is simply when you fold a corner of the page down to mark where you are in a book versus using a bookmark. And I brought this one up because there's a whole team of people who dog-ear and another who use bookmarks, and it's almost like a bookish personality trait that's come up over the last couple years. I'm not judging, but personally, I am on Team Bookmark because I don't like to ruin the corners of my books and overall try to maintain the quality of my books. Also because some of my books I try to sell after I finish reading. Although, I do know people nowadays who do like to buy well-loved/worn used books, so maybe I shouldn't worry as much about dog-earing. But in the end, it's your choice which team you're on. And also, buying bookmarks just ends up becoming a hyper-specific reading hobby if you do choose to use them. Now, this next one shouldn't sound too foreign if you've been living in the real world for the past decade or so, and it is fan fiction. Now, Fan fiction is any piece of work that can be written about any popular figures, real or fictional, and spans across TV shows, movies, books, actors/actresses, boy bands, etc. And like I said, even if you haven't read any, you've likely heard of fan fiction. This is embarrassing to admit that I used to read a lot of One Direction fanfic when I was in high school, mostly in my freshman and sophomore year, a bit beyond that as well though. And I read some on Wattpad, others on dedicated One Direction fan sites. And while fanfiction used to be viewed as a weird side hobby of mostly teenage girls putting their wildest daydreams on paper, a lot of fanfiction or Wattpad works have now been turned into actual published books that you can buy at major booksellers or are widely distributed online for people to purchase. One example I have is Hermione fanfiction, which, for those of you who don't know Harry Potter, it's Draco times Hermione. And FYI, I'm actually not sure if you're supposed to say times or by or X. I kind of really just took a guess there. So if anyone knows, please let me know below. But anyways, the two popular works that I've come across of Hermione fan fiction are Manacled and Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love. While I only ended up reading part of Manacled and yet to read the Mortifying Ordeal Being in Love, I do appreciate the level of detail in Manacled that the author put in, showing that they really did their research for these works. So, if you used to feel embarrassed about reading or writing fan fiction, don't. Looks like it's just part of the new normal of the book world at this point. And finally, the last term that I have on this list is being a mood reader or mood reading. And this one should be pretty explanatory, but to go into detail, a mood reader is someone who reads whatever they want to when they pick and read their next book or books. This is in contrast to people who plan their TBR ahead of time and try to stick to that each week, month, etc. For myself, I've pretty much been a mood reader since I started reading again in 2022. But this year, my challenge was to make monthly TBRs and try to stick to it. So I actually meet my reading goals for this year in terms of genres and authors. Unfortunately, I'm still not very good at sticking to my TBR and usually only end up reading 2 to 3 books, sometimes only one a month, and then just mood read the rest of the time. I think I attribute this failure to struggles I've had with high stress and being overwhelmed, particularly this year. And it's harder for me to pick up books of certain genres when I'm just going through a lot in other areas of my life. And I will say, it's definitely easier to be a mood reader when you get into the middle of a reading slump, as you're free to choose whatever you want to read to get you back in the groove, even if it's that Hermione fanfic, which I was just talking about. But there are definitely certain classics, and for me, Christian nonfiction that I want to read at least once in my lifetime. So hopefully I can continue to improve on building and sticking to my TBRs. But again, if you are a newer reader, being a mood reader might work out better for you at the start of your reading journey while you're still starting to expand your overall TBR. And that wraps up my list of bookish terms. Now, I did have additional acronyms and terms that I wanted to go over, so in order to make this episode a more reasonable length, I recorded a bonus segment, which you can go listen to on my Buy Me a Coffee page when you support the podcast. So, please head over there, link will be below in the show notes, and listen to the rest of this episode to learn more bookish terms. And as always, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you back here for episode 11. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I hope you were able to take away something, and be sure to follow the podcast for more bookish content. Until next time, stay fully booked, and I'll talk to you soon.